Hey everybody, welcome back. This slideshow is going to talk a little bit about Islam and kind of its spread um, into North Africa and Spain and a little bit of that. So if you want to follow along, this is the slideshow entitled Muhammad. All right, so I'm just going to kind of talk about Muhammad's life. At the end of this slideshow, I've got some information about the Quran and kind of Islamic belief, kind of Sunni Islamic belief. I'm not going to go over all that with you, but if you want to look through it, you kind of can. So this is more of a biographical lecture, I guess you could say. Muhammad's really important in Islam and also to history. Um, Muslims view him as the last and the greatest prophet. So Muslims believe that, like Abraham, King David, Jesus, those were all Islamic or Muslim prophets, and Muhammad is the last of these prophets and the greatest. He received the Quran from Allah through the angel Gabriel, and he's the perfect example for Muslims to follow. So, like in Christianity, Jesus would be the exemplar to follow, the person you're supposed to base your life off of. In Islam, it's Muhammad. And I've got some verses kind of talking about that. Surah 33, Muhammad is an excellent pattern for anyone who hopes in Allah in the last days. Um, you are of great moral character. Um, and other historical works besides the Quran talk about Muhammad being a good example to follow. So Muhammad's a really important person to study just because he's kind of set up as the best example for a Muslim to follow. I've got a timeline of his life, some of the main events. I'll kind of go through these throughout the slideshow, but I put them all at the beginning just so you can kind of look through them. So I'm going to get to slide 14 and kind of talk about things. So when Muhammad is born, he's born in about 570 AD. That's usually the date given. Arabia is a pagan society. It's not Islamic. Arabia, the Middle East, is pagan. There's lots of different Arabic tribes that worship many different gods. There's no state or laws. It's basically customs exist. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of blood feuds. This tribe fights this tribe. Child marriage is pretty common. Female infanticide is really common. There's stories in kind of pre-Islamic Arabia about uh, people burying their daughters when they're born in the sand because they want to have sons. Um, One of the things Islam or Muhammad stops is female infanticide. There's a verse in the Quran, I don't know it off the top of my head, but it talks about how at the day of judgment, all the girls that had been killed in the desert will cry out. Um, and that's one of the things like Islam and Christianity did. You know, the Romans and the Greeks, the pagan Romans and Greeks practice infanticide, leaving children exposed if they had a disability or something like that, or if they were a girl and they didn't want them. The pagans in Arabia did the same thing. So Christianity and Islam put an end to this practice. And there's also a Jewish and Christian population in Arabia. So, in the Middle East, there's lots of Christians and Jews. So Muhammad grew up around Christians and Jews. He would have heard stories from the Jewish and the Christian Bible. Muhammad's tribe is the Quraysh. Um, they're a powerful and influential tribe based in Mecca. Mecca is the most important city in Islam. Basically, they make a lot of money because people come every year to Mecca, to the Kaaba, because that's the pagan shrine that houses all the gods. So basically, all these pagans come to Mecca every year to basically worship these pagan gods and goddesses. And the Quraysh, which is a pagan tribe, Muhammad's tribe, they kind of oversee this. So they make a lot of money off of paganism. Now, Muhammad's father died before he was born. Some sources say shortly after, but a lot of them say before. His mother dies not too long after he's born, by about the age 6. So Muhammad's an orphan. He's raised by his uncle. Abu Talib. He's basically Muhammad's protection. He's kind of the leader of the tribe. And Muhammad works for his uncle, basically on caravan routes. So Muhammad traveled around a lot through Arabia. He went to Syria a lot. So he kind of has traveled the area. Um, some early biographies call him the honest and truthful one. Um, so he kind of had a reputation for being a good, I guess, trader, you could say. He ends up marrying his first wife through kind of his skills as a trader, a caravan leader. His first wife was named Khadija. She was a merchant woman. She's very wealthy. She has a business, and she basically hires Muhammad to take her goods up to Syria, I believe it is. And she's so impressed with how good a job Muhammad does that she offers to marry him. So she kind of proposes marriage. He was 25 at the time and she was 40, so she's quite a bit older than Muhammad. While she was alive, Muhammad only had one wife. After she died, Muhammad has lots of wives. The lowest number in the sources is 9, and some sources say as many as 23 wives. So um, if you read The Life of Muhammad, that's the first complete biography of Muhammad. It kind of talks about Khadijah and about how she was a successful woman and how she proposed marriage to Muhammad. So um, in AD 610, that's when Muhammad starts receiving the Quran. So he would go up to this cave, the cave of Hira. It's outside of Mecca, and he would kind of meditate or pray or just kind of silence himself. And he starts receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel from Allah. And the first revelation, the angel says, read, and Muhammad says, I can't read. Islamic tradition teaches that Muhammad was illiterate. And this happens over and over again. And finally, Muhammad says, what shall I read? And then the angel Gabriel tells him Surah 96, and that's the first part of the Quran. Muhammad talks about how basically he was really nervous when the angel first started coming to him. If you read the Hadith, um, Sahih Bukhari is the most important Hadith to Sunni Muslims. If slide 25, it says the angel caught me forcefully and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it anymore. He then released me and again asked me to read. Um, so it's a very intense moment. There's some of the hadith talk about how Muhammad thought he was possessed by a demon. He didn't know what was happening to him when these revelations were coming to him. There's multiple hadith that talk about how he thought about killing himself, committing suicide because he thought it was a demon. But every time he would go up to the mountains to throw himself off and kill himself, the angel would come to him and say, don't do this. You are receiving revelations from Allah. And his wife Khadijah kind of comforted him. She really helped him figure out helped him believe that these revelations were from Allah. She had a test that she talked about that they could tell if Gabriel was a demon or an angel. Um, Basically, what she said is, the next time the angel comes to you, Muhammad, tell me. And what she does is the angel shows up and Muhammad's like, there's the angel, I can see him. And Khadijah says, sit over here. Can you still see him? And Muhammad says, yes, I can still see the angel. She says, sit over here. Yes, I can still see him. And then she takes off her veil and the angel disappears because according to the life of Muhammad, that early biography, an angel won't be in the presence of an uncovered woman. So that's how Muhammad and Khadijah knew that it was an angel from Allah. Um, so he receives his first revelation. He tells his family about it, but he doesn't really go public and start preaching until 613. So he waits about 3 years, and he starts to tell others in Mecca about this, and his own tribe kind of turns against him. The Quraysh, they oppose him. They're pagans. They don't want this monotheism being preached because they make all the money from the pagans coming to worship in Mecca every year. Basically, the Quraysh give Muhammad a hard time. In 617, they start to boycott Muhammad. They won't have anything to do with him. Um, what ends up happening is Muhammad ends up fleeing. One night he goes on something called the night journey. He basically, some people say this is a spiritual journey, some say it's a literal journey, but he's taken to Jerusalem and he goes up to heaven and he meets all the the Jewish and the Christian prophets. So he meets like Moses and Jesus, uh, and talks with them, and then he goes up and meets Allah, and Allah talks to him and kind of just visits with him. Um, Around AD 20, Khadijah and Abu Talib die. These were the people closest to Muhammad, and the way kind of tribal the tribal system worked, Abu Talib was the main guy in the tribe, so he protected Muhammad. When he dies, other people feel like they can kind of attack Muhammad or maybe kill him, and some people do try to kill him because his powerful uncle is gone. Eventually, some men from the city of Yathrib come to Mecca and they meet Muhammad and they say, "Will you come to Yathrib and be like our judge? Will you help us in our disputes?" So Muhammad ends up fleeing to Yathrib. This is the future city of Medina. So before it was called Medina, it was called Yathrib. And if you look at slide 35, you can see it. There were 3 Jewish tribes in Yathrib and 2 Arab tribes. And now this is kind of why Muhammad was a judge over them, I guess you could say. The Jewish tribes believe in one God, they're monotheistic, so they're like Muhammad. But the Arab tribes are Arab, and Muhammad's an Arab. So basically, Muhammad had similarities with the Jews, and he had similarities with the Arabs. So that kind of made him a good mediator, I guess you could say, in their disputes. Eventually, since Mecca, when you're traveling to Syria, Yathrib is on the way. The Quraysh, the Meccans, start traveling their caravan route, so Muhammad starts raiding them. There's one raid called the Nakhla raid. Basically, Muhammad and the Quraysh start going to war against each other. There's 3 major battles. Muhammad fights against his own tribe, the Quraysh. The Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, and the Battle of the Trench. 624, 625, and 627. I'm not going to go into detail about each of these battles, but uh, basically, uh, there's a lot of fighting. I'll let you kind of read some of the accounts if you want to. The Battle of the Trench is kind of the most famous or infamous. What ends up happening is there's kind of some controversy in the sources about what exactly happened, but apparently there was one Jewish tribe left. Muhammad had banned the other Jewish tribes. He kicks them out of Yathrib. So the Jews that invited him there, he ends up kicking them out for different reasons. During the Battle of the Trench, when the Meccans, the Quraysh, come to attack Muhammad, the Jews supposedly were working out a deal with the Meccans to help defeat Muhammad. Now, they don't actually fight Muhammad, the Jews don't fight, but there's maybe the idea that they were going to hand over Muhammad to the Meccans. So what ends up happening is after the Meccans are defeated at the Battle of the Trench, supposedly the angel Gabriel came to Muhammad and said, why are you putting down your weapons? You still need to deal with the Jews because they were going to betray you. So what ends up happening is, through somebody else, Muhammad ends up having the Jews of Medina executed. The sources have different numbers. Some go as low as 600, some go as high as 900, but Muhammad had between 600 and 900 Jews beheaded, the last tribe in Yathrib. And this is in the life of Muhammad. This is in the Hadith. So it's in a lot of different Islamic sources. Muhammad took a wife from one of the Jews that was killed. He sold the other women and children for horses and weapons, so they're sold. After the Battle of the Trench, Muhammad basically makes a deal with the Meccans. This is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Basically, Muhammad quits raiding the Meccans when they're traveling up to Syria. The treaty doesn't acknowledge Muhammad as a prophet. Muhammad has to go back to Medina for a while, but he can come to Mecca later on. And eventually, in 630 AD, Muhammad returns to Mecca and conquers it. This is called the conquest of Mecca. But using the term conquest might be a little misleading. It's not like there's a huge battle. By this time, Muhammad is so strong, the Meccans know they can't win. So basically, it's a conquest, but it's there's not very much bloodshed. Muhammad does have a list of people he once killed. Some of them are apostates, people who have left Islam. Muhammad repeatedly said, if you leave Islam, you should die. So he does kill some people who had wronged him previously, but he doesn't like put the whole city to the sword or anything. Muhammad goes and destroys all the pagan idols, breaks them, burns them with fire. He fights other battles throughout Arabia. He ends up sending a letter to the Byzantine emperor and to the Persian king, and basically says, I'm inviting you to Islam, but if you don't submit to Islam, that's your own problem, and we'll conquer you eventually. And Islam does conquer the Persian and the Byzantine empires eventually. People that aren't Muslim are called dhimmis that live under Islamic rule. They're basically protected people, so like Jews and Christians, they have to pay a special tax and they're second-class citizens, but they're not killed. Usually the Muslims had some sort of respect for Jews and Christians as second-class citizens because they believe that Allah had given the Jews and the Christians sacred books before. Now, Muslims believe that Jews and Christians have corrupted the Torah and the Bible, so we don't even know what God sent to the Jews and Christians because they've corrupted it. The Quran is the uncorruptible word of God in Muslim views, in the Muslim view. What else do I want to say? Islam spreads through war. You can look at the map and see how much territory they conquered. Muhammad did say that the way he wanted to die was in jihad. If you look at slide 75, you can see here's a hadith reading from Sahih Bukhari. That's the most important Sunni hadith. Basically, he said, I would like to get martyred fighting and then be reborn and get martyred again and be reborn and get martyred again, just over and over again. That's kind of how I want to die. Muhammad also gave orders to expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula. This is in the Hadith. There's a lot of political assassinations that Muhammad undertakes. I'm going to have you read some of these. You can look through them if you want. So I'm going to skip over this. If you look at slide 90, that's kind of the different phases of the spread of Islam. So that dark red portion, that's where Islam had spread by the time Muhammad died. The rest of it spreads when his followers take over. Now, according to the Hadith, the way Muhammad dies is he gets poisoned by a Jewish woman. There's this city or this town called Khaybar, and Muhammad attacked it, and he killed this woman's, I think it was her uncle, her husband, and maybe a brother. But he basically killed all the important men in her life. And after he did this, she offered to cook a meal for Muhammad, and she cooks a sheep, and she asked Muhammad what part of the sheep was his favorite, and he tells her. So then she poisons it, and basically Muhammad eats the sheep that was poisoned, and he doesn't die right away, but he dies years later. If you look at slide 93, here's a hadith that says Muhammad used to tell his wife Aisha. Aisha was Muhammad's wife. She was 6 years old when she married Muhammad, and he was like 50 something. They consummated their marriage. Muhammad was in his 50s and she was 9 years old the first time they had sex. But Aisha, that's his favorite wife. Muhammad used to tell her that he said, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar, And at this time, I feel as if my aorta is being cut from the poison. So basically, his aorta, he felt like it was getting cut, which there's a really curious verse in the Quran, Surah 69, 44 through 46, that kind of talks about getting your aorta cut. I've never really understood it, but you can kind of look at it if you want. So after Muhammad dies, in a pretty short time, Islam conquers, Jerusalem, parts of the Persian Empire, North Africa. In the early 700s, he dies in 632. So by the end of the 600s, the Muslims are getting ready to invade Spain. So they conquer parts of Spain. And then by 732, they go up and fight Charles Martel in France. So, within 100 years of Muhammad's death, Islam has spread really quickly and over a large amount of territory. So we kind of don't really talk about Islam much anymore after this until we get to the Crusades. But that's kind of setting up the Crusades, which will happen later on. I was trying to think if there's anything else I was going to point out. Let me see. I did want to tell you kind of one thing about how to maybe help read the Quran. Okay. Sorry, I got to put the slide number in here real quick. So let me put this in, and then I can tell you what I wanted to tell you. Okay, if you look at slide 104, I want to read you a passage from the Quran. And the reason I'm doing this is, if you read the Jewish or Christian Bibles, they're very narrative based. They tell a story, they have lots of different characters. Usually there's a narrator, and then they'll be like, God said this, and Moses said this, or David did this. So there's dialogue, there's climax to the action, there's resolution. The Quran is a little different. It's basically Allah speaking through the whole Quran. So it's really hard sometimes to understand what's going on. The context, the Quran doesn't often tell you the context. So a lot of times when you're reading the Quran, you almost need a commentary, which I think is called a tafsir. But if you look at slide 104, here's an example. So it says, the believers are only those who believe in Allah and His Messenger, and who, when they are meeting with Him for a matter of common interest, do not depart until they have asked His permission. Indeed, those who ask your permission, O Muhammad, those are the ones who believe in Allah and His Messenger. So when they ask your permission for something of their affairs, then give permission to whom you will among them and ask forgiveness for them of Allah. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful. So what does this mean? We don't really know. But if you read the life of Muhammad, you'll figure that out. Because throughout this book, it will say, like, here's where Surah, 24 comes from. It'll kind of tell you the context. So it gives you a historical perspective, I guess you could say. So here's what that verse is talking about. During the Battle of the Trench, Muhammad is digging a trench before the battle starts. And there's a lot of Muslims that were basically saying, I don't really want to dig this trench. So they would go to Muhammad and they would basically say, hey, can I go run and do this? Or my family needs help with this. Can I go help them? And they would basically get out of their responsibility for digging. So according to Ibn Ishaq, the author of this book, Muhammad is getting tired of people always leaving their responsibilities. So Muhammad gets a revelation from Allah, and Allah says, hey Muhammad, the only people that are really true Muslims are the ones that actually help you. So basically, Muhammad had, he was tired of people shirking their responsibilities, so he gets a revelation from Allah that says, people that shirk their responsibilities to you aren't really true Muslims. They don't make excuses. They'll stay there and dig with you, dig the trench. So if you read the Quran and you read either the life of Muhammad or read the Hadith, that will kind of give you context to the Quran, and it really does help out. So you can look through the rest of the slides if you want. I'm not going to quiz you on them. So that's kind of the life of Muhammad, I guess you could say. Um, we'll kind of continue on with the Middle Ages.